entered the moving the goalpost phase of the Trump administration's response to the fallout from news of a double-tap boat strike in the Caribbean in which U.S. forces killed survivors from an attack on an alleged drug trafficking vessel. What experts from across the political spectrum believe may have been a war crime. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth today called it a matter of, quote, deterrence. Watch.
Deterrence has to matter, not arrest and hand over and then do it again, the rinse and repeat approach of previous administrations. This is meant to get after that approach. And I will just end by saying, as President Trump always has our back, we always have the back of our commanders who are making decisions in difficult situations, and we do in this case and all these strikes. They're making judgment calls and ensuring that they defend the American people. They've done the right things. We'll keep doing that, and we have their backs.
In which the Secretary of Defense comes out against arresting any survivors. There's brand new reporting in the Washington Post on this story, and it reveals that military officials are today angry at comments like that. They see it as an attempt to shift blame for the killing of those two survivors from the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, to the commander overseeing the operation, Admiral Frank Bradley. Admiral Bradley is a decorated Navy SEAL. He has decades of experience. He was among the first to deploy to Afghanistan after the September 11th terrorist attacks. He is currently the head of the U.S. Special Operations Command, which oversees operations in more than 80 countries. The Washington Post reports at the White House press briefing that we showed you yesterday, in which Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that it was Bradley who authorized the strikes, quote, elicited a furious backlash within the Defense Department, where officials described feeling angry at the uncertainty over whether Hegseth would take responsibility for his alleged role in the operation or leave the military and civilian staff under him to face the consequences. Quote, this is Protect Pete bull bleep, said one military official. Another official said of Leavitt's statement, quote, it is throwing us, the service members, under the bus, end quote. Another person said some of Hegseth's top civilian staff appeared deeply alarmed about the revelations and were contemplating whether to leave the administration. Meanwhile, the New York Times also has new reporting on the incident. Citing 5 U.S. officials, the New York Times reports this, quote, Hegseth, ahead of the September 2nd attack, ordered a strike that would kill the people on the boat and destroy the vessel and its purported cargo of drugs. But, each official said, Hegseth's directive did not specifically address what should happen if a first missile turned out not to fully accomplish all those things. And these officials said his order was not a response to surveillance footage showing that at least 2 people on the boat survived the first blast, end quote. Now, none of what is being reported today disputes that a verbal order to kill everyone on board happened, which is what the Washington Post reported in the first story that blew all of this wide open and into public view. It also invites more questions about Hegseth's conduct during the attack. As friend of this program, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling remarked yesterday, quote, from a military perspective, if a subordinate is about to give an unlawful order, it is also a requirement for a senior official to stop him from executing it and then counsel him. So there's that too, end quote. And we know that Hegseth was involved. We know that he watched it live. He told us himself the day after the strike. Watch that.
That was definitely not artificial intelligence. I watched it live. We knew exactly who was in that boat. We knew exactly what they were doing, and we knew exactly who they represented. And that was Tren de Aragua, a narco-terrorist organization designated by the United States, trying to poison our country with illicit drugs.
I watched it myself. It wasn't AI. The White House earlier today, Pete Hegseth said that he watched the strike. But he said he didn't stay around for the entirety of the operation, adding this, quote, I did not personally see survivors. The thing was on fire. This is called the fog of war. So now we have a new piece, right? In Pete Hegseth's world, there was something more important that day than monitoring a live feed of a lethal strike being carried out by the men and women of the military. Something more important was happening at the Pentagon that day. This morning, the Bulwark summed up what Hegseth has had to say so far this way, quote, in other words, Hegseth was there watching live but didn't issue any orders, but was extremely happy that the spirit of the orders he never issued were executed anyway. which he then took credit for in real time and hailed as a glorious triumph without revealing that it wasn't. All of this, of course, is perfectly ripe for a bipartisan investigation by Congress. It is what they are supposed to do. But Team Trump, once happy to go on Fox News and celebrate the strike in those friendly confines, has suddenly gone silent. The Washington Post reports this, quote, Senators Roger Wicker and Jack Reed published 2 letters they had sent to the Pentagon weeks earlier requesting the videos and orders documenting the boat strike, which so far have killed more than 80 people. To date, the Pentagon has not complied, a delay that has surpassed the time required by law for the administration to respond to Congress. A mountain of violations and excuses and finger-pointing and nonsensical statements and passing the buck to the men and women of the military, as the Trump administration faces questions now as to who knew when what appears like a war crime was committed. That's where we start today. Here with me at the table, my dear friend, my dear colleague, Rachel Maddow. We'll talk to her about everything going on, but importantly, she's here at the table to talk about her brand new must-listen podcast, Burn Order. First, I want to bring in, though, for our benefit and to inform our conversation, retired U.S. Air Force Major General Stephen Lepper. He served as Deputy JAG there, as well as Deputy Legal Counsel to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's also a member of the former JAGS Working Group. It's an honor to have you here. I tried to get smart enough to ask you the best questions I could think of, but can you just make clear in my mind the act that is not in dispute, which is that after the first strike, after the boat was on fire from top to bottom, bow to stern, I think is the right way to say it, there were 2 survivors, and that any strike that killed them is, the act itself is a war crime. Is that the place from which we're starting?
It really is. And what you described and what the Washington Post described in its initial reporting was no less than murder, to put it very succinctly. When you're involved in a military operation, there is fog of war, as the Secretary said, but the law is still the law, and the law doesn't change whether or not there's fog obstructing it. And so what failed in this situation was that everyone from the Secretary of Defense on down to the people who pulled the trigger failed to recognize or recognized and did not do their duty to disobey an unlawful order.
General,
folks in the water are defenseless, and attacking them is indefensible.
And folks, we're quick to point out on this show that at every level of the military, that is the actual example of defenselessness. That in the water, an attack on a vessel that leaves any of the passengers alive but in the water is the line that is put into the training, put into the military. This may sound like a dumb question, but I just have to ask it. Admiral Bradley would have known that, right?
Absolutely, especially as a naval officer. I mean, he would be familiar with the rules regarding maritime rescue of shipwrecked sailors. And in this particular case, his first strike shipwrecked those sailors and shifted his duty from one of attack to one of rescue.
So what do you think happened?
Well, I believe that at some point, someone's orders were either intended or construed to include killing everyone on board, including survivors. And that is an order, quite frankly, that in and of itself is a violation of the law. You cannot give orders that require no surrender or no survivors to be rescued or civilians to be killed. And if any of those were present in that situation, our duty is to protect them under the law, not continue to target them. So communication may have broken down. People may have interpreted the Secretary's kill everybody order, which the Washington Post reported he gave, to include everybody, including those protected classes. But at some point along the way, everyone who was obliged to disobey what is clearly an unlawful order. An unlawful order, as you said, is a textbook example from the DoD law of war. An example of an unlawful order is killing survivors in a shipwreck. Someone along the way should have recognized that was an unlawful order and disobeyed it, or at least questioned it and gotten clarification by the person who issued it.
General, let me ask you this. If an operation is viewed in real time, there's a live feed, but it's also recorded for multiple reasons. Maybe the most important for the spirit of this conversation is oversight and the record. The video exists. The answers are knowable to all the questions you just posited. What needs to happen to make sure that all of that is preserved and that all of the answers and the truth and the role of Admiral Bradley and everybody who serves under him is known and that the facts emerge?
Well, the one ray of hope in this whole story is that Congress has agreed to investigate this, because in investigating, I hope they will be able to do is get all of that evidence. They'll conduct a forensic investigation, which will include getting all of the videotapes, getting all of the testimony of the people who were involved in the strike from the top all the way down to the trigger pullers. And we'll be able to approach this as a way to collect the evidence for their own use, but hopefully the use of anyone who is going to be holding the people responsible accountable. Because at some point, if Congress fails to investigate this as fully as is necessary to sustain some kind of accountability under the law, then an investigation of that sort will have to occur as well. And right now, I'm just not sure that this administration has expressed any willingness at all or evidenced any willingness at all to engage in that kind of investigation or in that kind of accountability.